Russia, 1812. Napoleon invades his former ally with the largest army Europe has ever seen. But for the French emperor, the decisive blow remains frustratingly beyond reach. Russia's resilience is unlike anything he's ever encountered, and as winter closes in his army begins the most infamous retreat in history. September 15th, 1812, 83 days after invading Russia, a week after his costly victory at Borodino, Napoleon entered Moscow. He expected to be greeted by dignitaries, formally offering the city's surrender. Instead, he discovered that 90% of Moscow's inhabitants had fled a fire had started the previous night and was blamed on drunken soldiers. But over the next 48 hours, fires continued to break out across Moscow until most of the city was ablaze. Count Theodore Eustache, the city's governor, but ordered that Moscow be destroyed rather than allowed to fall into enemy hands. And now fires were being started deliberately by Russian criminals freed from jail and acting on police orders. French soldiers rounded up and shot any they could catch, but the inferno was impossible to contain. In 4 days, 2/3 of Moscow was destroyed, with the fires finally under control. Napoleon's soldiers turned their attention to systematically looting the ruined city, while from his new quarters in the Kremlin, Napoleon sent a letter to Emperor Alexander in St. Petersburg, inviting him to make peace and end the war. He received no reply. Napoleon waited, confident that Alexander would eventually negotiate, but as the days passed, he grew increasingly uneasy. Cossack raids were disrupting his vital communications with Paris, as well as the arrival of supplies, while the steady attrition of French forces and Russian reinforcements meant Napoleon was outnumbered for the first time in the campaign. Rumors also reached him that his reluctant allies, Prussia and Austria, were in secret talks with his enemies. Napoleon had proposed that the army winter in Moscow, but that now looked too dangerous. Reluctantly, he accepted that the army would have to move back to Smolensk to find safe winter quarters. Napoleon knew how severe Russian winters could be, but continued to put off his departure. Reassured by fine October weather and hoping that at the last minute there might be a message from Alexander offering peace, it never came. On October 13th, the first light snow fell. 5 days later, Kutuzov launched a surprise attack on Murat's advanced guard at Vancouver and defeated it. Napoleon, stung into action, gave the order for the army to leave Moscow the next day. 100,000 men of the Gongda May left Moscow in a column 10 miles long, with an estimated 40,000 carriages and carts. There were women and children too, army wives and the vivandières, the women who cooked for the soldiers, as well as some civilians. Every wagon and pack was stuffed with as much food and loot as possible. As he set off, Sergeant Belgoni of the Imperial Guard made an inventory of his pack. It contained several pounds of sugar, some rice, some biscuit, half a bottle of liqueur, a woman's Chinese silk dress, embroidered in gold and silver, several gold and silver ornaments amongst them, a piece of the cross of Ivan the Great. Besides these, I had my uniform, a woman's large riding cloak, 2 silver pictures in relief, 12 inches long and 8 high, all in the finest workmanship. Also several lockets, and the Russian prince's spittoon, set with precious stones. I wore over my shirt a yellow silk waistcoat, which I had made myself out of a woman's skirt. Over that, A large cape lined with ermine and a large pouch hung at my side by a silver cord. This was full of various things, amongst them a crucifix in gold and silver, and a little Chinese porcelain vase. Then there were my firearms, powder flask, and 60 cartridges in the box. This heavily encumbered army did not yet realize it was in a race against time. The Russians were beginning to move against the flanks of Napoleon's 550-mile deep salient. That very day, Wittgenstein's army was driving back Marshal Sasseur's outnumbered force at Pulaski and drawing Victor's 9th Corps west to support them in the south. Admiral Chichagov's advance at Schwarzenberg's Austrian Corps falling back to cover Warsaw. The corridor was closing, and then there was the weather. Though Napoleon was confident his army could reach winter quarters in Smolensk in 20 days, well before the more extreme temperatures were due to hit. Napoleon planned to withdraw via Kaluga through unspoiled country where the army could forage for supplies. But Kutuzov sent General Doktorov's 6th Corps to block the road at Maloyaroslavets in fierce fighting. Italian troops of Eugen's 4th Corps drove the Russians out of the town. It was a hard one. Victory, reminiscent of the fighting at Borodino, Kutuzov now stood between Napoleon and Kaluga. Napoleon now took the unusual step of conferring with his marshals, and after discussing various options, he decided that rather than seek another major battle, they would retreat the way they'd come. Along the Smolensk road, Napoleon had hoped to avoid this route as it meant marching back through country already stripped bare of supplies the day after the fighting of Maloyaroslavets. Napoleon was nearly captured by a group of Cossacks and saved only by General Rapp's charge. At the head of his escort after this close shave, Napoleon had a phial of poison made up which he carried around his neck. In case of capture, Napoleon's army set off on its new course, shadowed at a respectful distance by Kutuzov's army. To the south, they passed the old battlefield of Borodino, a grisly, unnerving sight where crows pecked at half-buried corpses. Relentless marching quickly began to tire out men and horses. A few days later, the temperature fell below freezing. The army's overworked, starving horses died on. Mass discipline began to break down as some drivers simply dumped the sick and wounded by the roadside to try to ensure their own survival. As the French column became increasingly strung out, General Miller-Radovich, commanding Kutuzov's advance guard, fell on Davout rearguard outside the Asma for a few hours. Davout's first call was cut off until Ujna and Ney came to his rescue. The battle ended with street fighting in Vyazma, as the French hastily evacuated the burning town for the soldiers of the Grand Army, so unaccustomed to retreats and routes. Vyazma was an alarming, demoralizing blow. On November 4th, it began to snow heavily. The next night, temperatures plummeted to minus 20 degrees centigrade. Few men or women have proper winter clothing or access to shelter. Many froze to death overnight. The next morning, wagons and guns were abandoned. Many soldiers sought to save themselves, ignoring officers stealing horses and food, and then leaving the column to scour the countryside for supplies. Many of these foragers were found by the Cossacks, some cut down, or last others robbed of every possession and left to freeze. In a few cases, they were handed over to peasants, for retribution against the foreign invaders who had plundered all they owned. As the army struggled on towards Smolensk through blizzards, Napoleon ordered Eugen's 4th Corps to strike out for Vitebsk. where there was large French supply depots. But Vitebsk had already fallen to the Russians' Fourth Corps, was too weak to fight its way through, and rejoined the army, minus its artillery and most of its baggage. A colonel who saw Fourth Corps at this stage described men without shoes, almost without clothes, exhausted and vanished, sitting on their packs, sleeping on their knees, and only rousing themselves out of this stupor to grill slices of horse meat or melt bits of ice. Just 3 weeks after leaving Moscow, a third of the army was dead or captured. About half the rest formed a growing army of stragglers, men without units prepared to fight. Only to survive, Napoleon reached Smolensk on November 9th. The first troops into town ransacked the supply depots, leaving nothing for those who followed, including Naze rearguard, which arrived 6 days later. Napoleon had hoped to make Smolensk his winter base, but the state of the army and lack of supplies meant the retreat had to continue. But the 5 days he spent there gave Kutuzov time to circle ahead and prepare an ambush. When the French retreat resumed, he struck 30 miles west of Smolensk at Krasny. In 3 days of desperate fighting through knee-deep snow, Napoleon used his Imperial Guard to hold open the road as Oshame and Davout's corps fought their way through the ambush with heavy losses. 2 regiments of the Young Guard were ordered to make a sacrificial counterattack to keep the Russians at bay and were virtually annihilated. Kutuzov held back many of his troops and was blamed for not trying to destroy Napoleon's army when he had the chance. It's possible he was concerned of the number of raw conscripts in his own army also suffering terribly in the freezing conditions. Not every French corps broke through. At Krasny, Marshal May and his 6,000-strong rearguard arrived on November 18th to find the road blocked by 60,000 Russian troops, but no sign of the promised support from Davout's First Corps. These men hold themselves against the Russian lions with desperate courage, but were mowned down, rejecting several invitations to surrender. They led the survivors in a daring night crossing of the Dnepr River, then across 45 miles of open country under constant attack from Platovsk Cossacks to reach Osha. By the time Ney rejoined the army, Israel Guard was down to just 800 fighting men, leading a column of several thousand stragglers. The army regarded his escape as a miracle, and when Napoleon heard of it, he immediately dubbed Marshal Ney the bravest of the brave. Napoleon had escaped one trap, but now 3 Russian armies were closing in from different directions and outnumbered him nearly 3 to 1 from the east. Kutuzov's main army, with 65,000 men from the north. Wittgenstein, with 30,000, steadily driving back Marshal Victor's 9th Corps, and from the south, Admiral Chichagov's army of Moldavia, with 34,000, having detached General Austin Zakin with 30,000 to prevent Schwarzenberg's. Austrians and Rainier's Saxon Corps marching to Napoleon's aid. Napoleon was heading from Minsk, a major French supply base with vast stores of the food, clothing, shoes, and ammunition, but his army so desperately needed. But on November 21st, disastrous news arrived. Minsk had fallen to Chichagov. He then marched on Borisov, driven out the Polish garrison and captured its bridge over the Buzina River. By rights, the bed is now ought to a frozen solid by now, so Napoleon could have crossed anywhere. But a sudden thaw had turned the river into a torrent of ice and freezing water. Napoleon was at least joined by the hard-fighting Marshal Oudinot and his Second Corps, which hadn't suffered as badly as the main column on its retreat from Place Oudinot, launched an immediate counterattack on Borisov and retook the town, but couldn't stop the Russians burning the bridge with no other bridge for miles in either direction. It seemed Napoleon's exhausted army was finally doomed, but there was one sliver of hope. Polish cavalry had found a ford. Across the river, near the village of Studianka, Napoleon issued a flurry of orders. Second Corps was to fake preparations for a river crossing south of Borisov. Victor's 9th Corps, arriving from the north, was to form a rear guard east of Studianka to hold the Russians at bay while engineers worked as quickly as possible to build pontoon bridges across the river and win Napoleon's army a fighting chance of escape. On the afternoon of November 25th, General Ablay's Dutch engineers began building two 300-foot pontoon bridges across the Berezina River. They worked day and night, sometimes chest-deep in freezing water, and completed both bridges in less than 24 hours. Few of the engineers survived the ordeal. Chichagov had been totally fooled by the diversion south of Borisov and was moving his troops south to face it, allowing Napoleon's army to begin crossing its rickety bridges virtually unopposed. Oudinot's Second Corps LED, the way to secure a bridgehead, followed the next day by the remnants of the main army. Priority was given to form troops, still able to fight for the time being. The army's vast crowd of stragglers remained on the far bank. By the time Chichagov realized his mistake and began moving north, Napoleon had troops in place to defend the crossing on the east bank. General Partner's 12th Division, 4,000 relatively fresh troops from Victor's 9th Corps formed the rear guard. As Platov's Cossacks approached from the east, the vanguard of Kutuzov's main army, Antonov, tried to rejoin 9th Corps, but caught in a swirling blizzard with visibility down to 50 meters. He marched straight into Wittgenstein's army. His entire division was killed or captured. The next morning, Chichagov and Wittgenstein launched coordinated attacks on both sides of the river. There was desperate fighting on the west bank, where Marshal Oudinot was yet again seriously wounded. But his Swiss infantry held the line until General Dumeric's Kudassias, the army's last heavy cavalry, charged and routed the Russians at great cost. Polish and German troops of Victor's rearguard held off the Russians until dark, then pulled back across the bridges. For 2 nights, officers have been trying to get the vast camp of stragglers to cross the bridges when they weren't being used, but with temperatures reaching -30 centigrade, they preferred to stay put, huddled around their fires at dawn on the 29th. With the army leaving and the Russians approaching, thousands of stragglers surged in panic towards the bridges. Dozens were crushed underfoot. Others fell or were pushed into the water or tried to swim, which was certain death. When French engineers burned the bridges at 9 a.m., thousands were cut off and left to the mercy of the advancing Cossacks. Some became prisoners. Others were simply put out of their misery since the retreat began 43 days earlier. The Grande Armée had marched nearly 500 miles under constant attack, starved, exhausted, and for the last 23 days in lethal sub-zero temperatures without proper clothing or shelter. In that time, the fighting strength of the Kong army had been reduced from around 124,000 men to 20,000. with as many stragglers still following the army as the retreat continued. To Vilna, the weather turned even worse, the temperatures falling to -37 degrees centigrade. The Russian army is at least now held back, leaving the winter Cossacks and Russian peasants to finish off the invaders on December 5th. Napoleon left the army traveling incognito across Europe at breakneck speed and reaching Paris in just 13 days. Naturally, English satirists capitalized on Napoleon seeming to abandon his defeated army, and many soldiers did regard it as an act of betrayal. But his generals supported his decision to leave. There'd already been one attempted coup against Napoleon in Paris, and there was much work to be done to rebuild the army and reassure France's allies. On December 9th, 51 days after the retreat began, around 20,000 ragged survivors of the Vendée began crossing the Niemen River back into friendly Polish territory. According to legend, Marshal Ney was the last man across. Napoleon's invasion of Russia had proved to be one of the greatest military disasters in history. He had made fatal miscalculations about geography, logistics, and above all, Russia's political and strategic response to his invasion. These blunders cost his empire around 500,000 men, as well as 250,000 horses and 1,000 cannon. Put another way, of every 12 men who marched into Russia with the Khan army, one was killed in action or died of wounds. 2 were taken prisoner, one of whom died in captivity. 7 died from disease or the effects of climate. Just 2 returned alive. Contrary to myth, many more soldiers had died in the summer advance from heat, typhus, and dysentery than were lost in the winter retreat. Russian military casualties were estimated at 150,000, and a huge but unknown number of civilian deaths. The Russian campaign was a catastrophe for Napoleon, not just in lost troops and resources, but in damage to prestige and reputation. That winter, all his enemies sensed weakness and prepared to join forces against him. But the emperor wasn't going down without a fight. Back in Paris, he admitted to his ministers, "Fortune has dazzled me, gentlemen. I've let it lead me astray. Instead of following my plan, I went to Moscow. I thought I'd make peace there. I stayed too long. I've made a grave mistake, but I'll have the means to repair it.